Hello and welcome back to AP World History Mod. Today we're going to begin Unit 8.1, setting the stage for the Cold War and decolonization. Today we're largely going to be focusing in on decolonization as a concept. We're going to watch a quick video on the Cold War, kind of get you started on that. And for skill practice, really, I'm going to be approaching decolonization today just as a way to kind of get you thinking about decolonization before you start doing your individual homeworks, and maybe giving you some categories of analysis, some contextualization approaches, and really just some ways of looking at this topic in a more nuanced way, so that if you want to earn the complexity point, this might work. All right, so here's our standards for today. And we're looking to explain the historical context of the Cold War after 1945. All right, so decolonization. So we've already seen this slide on an earlier day, but just kind of recenter ourselves, right? Decolonization, we're talking about this process of Indian colonial rule, Indian imperialism, and establishing new sovereign regimes. So this post-World War II era is the immediate aftermath is when it's going to take place. And really, if there's like a window where most of these 150 countries or almost 150 countries get created, it's between about 1955 and 65 or so is kind of the window. Some happen before, some happen after, but most kind of fall into that window. All right, so and of course, there's all kinds of significant leaders that that we'll case study and look at over the next, I guess for the remainder of the course. However, we're not going to do a lot of case studies today. We're just gonna, just kind of look at some ways to approach this topic. So hopefully, when you do your homeworks, you'll be able to fill in some of these gaps, with some of these examples with evidence. Okay. All right. So to kind of start, just give us a visual here. This is a map of the kind of colonial imperial holdings on the eve of World War I, right? And you see kind of the colonial possessions, specifically looking here in Africa and in Asia, kind of the remaining colonial holdings. And then we can see by 1974 what was left of these kind of imperial holdings in Africa and Asia. So we look at this, some of the questions that kids often ask is, well, why Portugal? Why is Portugal still have a colonial footprint there in 74? And that's if you're looking at that and thinking that is a wonderful way to be processing this. Why Portugal, right? Why are they the ones that that were the last ones standing there? So we'll look at that, right? But I highly encourage looking at maps like this and then coming up with these questions. Right? It's good to be inquisitive, and find out answers why. All right, so today let's kind of start this and let's look at decolonization. And of course, this is one of the most kind of fundamental changes that occur in the world in the second half of the 20th century. How do you understand the modern world without understanding this process, right? So, you've got, you have a complete transition, a shift from a world order ruled by colonial powers to a world of independent sovereign nations. If we're going to kind of use this as as a way of thinking of things, I'll often like to kind of contextualize this idea of a world order, and kind of build up to what this means. And the way I generally start off with, I guess if you're really crazy, you can go back to 1648 to the Peace of Westphalia, but the more common way of doing it is by looking at something like 1815 and say that European countries came together in Vienna in 1815 at the Congress of Vienna following the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and created what becomes known as the Concert of Europe, where the major powers of Europe like France and England and Austria-Hungary and Russia, they were the conductors, and the rest of the countries were the orchestra. And as long as you allow the major countries to conduct, then there will be harmony in Europe. Harmony meaning peace. And And if you look at the 1800s as a whole, it is relatively peaceful. With the exception of a disruption in the harmony that comes in 1871 as a result of the creation of Italy and Germany specifically. And then you could make an argument that that disruption, later causes the instability that results in World War I. So we see a take two at the world order at Versailles in 1919 with the creation of the League of Nations, where once again the European powers, because the United States is absent from this body, but the European powers are now going to usher in a time of peace and stability in the aftermath of World War I. By the time we get to the end of World War II, a lot of the confidence in these European institutions to provide stability and order are a little less trusted. And so we're going to see a transition to where independent sovereign nations becomes the new norm. And there is an international organization that is created, which functions pretty well under that system, if you want to call it functioning pretty well. But it does allow for those principles to become paramount, and that's the United Nations. Okay. All right. So, what do we need to consider when we start looking at decolonization? Right. If you're picking out a case study to kind of research and focus in on, think about the visions that inspire their independence itself, whether they're negotiating their independence or whether they are fighting for their independence. What are they negotiating for? What are they fighting for? What are their goals in the lead up to, independence? Are they advocating, are they advocating democracy and self-determination in the Woodrow Wilson mode? Is that what they're advocating? Are they advocating a return to a local monarchy? And that kind of rule. Are they advocating socialism? What are they advocating? And then, once they gain independence, what becomes the reality? If they were advocating self-determination, does that become the reality? So just kind of, it's a good way to try to pick out individual leaders and demonstrate continuity and changes within those leaders. Okay. How was the vision implemented by those who brought about this change? So you need that application to know if there was a continuity in their beliefs or changes in their beliefs. Number three, what are the consequences of creating so many new nations in a 30-year time span following 1945, or even that 10-year time block when most of it takes place? Countries that might be able to help usher in this transition, how are you going to help 30 countries in 1 year, becoming independent? There's a lot of chaos involved in a lot of this change. Okay, and of course, what happens when decolonization collides with other foundational change in the modern world? Things like the Cold War or globalization. If there are three primary movements that take place in the second half of the 20th century, the Cold War, globalization, decolonization, I'm going to guess that most of you have heard of the Cold War and globalization, right? Why haven't you heard of decolonization? This is something that affects most people on planet Earth, and I'm going to guess most of your peers at my high school who take regular world history probably have covered very little decolonization. Right, so, obviously those other two are significant movements that take place, major changes that take place, but obviously this is also a very significant movement. Okay, all right, so let's kind of look at this and how they all are intertwined. Right, one kind of good thing to point out here is, if you ever have to write an LEQ about or DBQ about globalization, then decolonization provides a very good point for contextualization. If you ever have to write a DBQ or an LEQ about decolonization, globalization does provide, right, some good sourcing, possible contextualization for that as well. Cold War definitely as well. All right. So, the globalization, Cold War, decolonization, right? If you have to write about one, you can use the other to contextualize because they're all occurring concurrently. And they all have impacts on the other. All right. Decolonization shortfalls. Like, what are some of the shortcomings or issues that arise? I did have a student ask, what does shortfall mean? For example, one of the shortfalls from the SAQs that I just returned is a lot of you identified specific pieces of evidence to answer the question, but you did not explain how that evidence supports or answers the question. Explanation is where you are in the point. All right, so drop the fact, that is necessary. Explanation is the shortcoming or the shortfall that many people face. So make sure you explain how your evidence answers the question. All right, so decolonization shortfalls. Very rarely do we see smooth transitions of power. Korea, look at the Korean story for, half a century before, we see decolonization in this case here. Obviously, Korea, you start to see Japanese troops following the Sino-Japanese War that ends in the mid-1890s. You see the official annexation of Korea by the Japanese in 1910, and then they will be held until 1945. And then what happens next? We see the instant creation of a North Korea and South Korea by the Soviet Union and the United States. Right, China. Right, what is China's transition? We see the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911 and the establishment of a nationalist regime under Sun Yat-sen. Consolidation of power. And the end of warlordism really doesn't happen until we get into the mid 1920s. And then it's going to be under Chiang Kai-shek by that point. And then by 1927, we see a civil war break out between Chiang and Mao. And in the middle of that, you're going to see the Japanese invasion of northern China or Manchuria in 1931. And then, it appears that we have the communists and Mao defeated by about 1934. And it looks like Chiang is going to be able to, begin to build China back, or unify it. And then in 1937, the Japanese will invade, right? And so we're going to be, most of the country is going to be occupied, or, the economic hub of the country is going to be occupied from 1937 until 1945. And then, between 1945 and 1937, China becomes, what you call one of the very first proxy wars of the Cold War. The Soviet Union helps out Mao and the communist forces. The United States helps out Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist forces, and then by 1949, we see, the People's Republic of China is established, as well as the Republic of China, aka Taiwan. Is that a smooth transition? To come into power in 1949. Obviously not. And of course, the story of the Middle East. Pick your country. A lot of the contextual stories for there begin in a hotel room in Paris in 1916 with Sykes and Picot. And of course, when you start talking about after World War II comes to an end, let's talk about throwing in Israel to the mix in 1947. And officially wrapping up their War of Independence in 49, right? So, it's not going to be a smooth transition for anyone involved, right? So, extreme violence will often accompany, right, the kind of later stages of decolonization. In Algeria, you have a violence breakout literally the day the Germans surrendered in May of 1945. You see violence break out in Algeria. Algeria is a French colony, northern Africa. All right, so if you're not familiar with Algeria, it had been a French colony since around 1830 or so. I think it was a couple of years earlier than that you start to see, But Algeria is a settler colony. Right? It was a settler colony, and probably because it was a settler colony, the French hold on to it. very tightly. So Algeria is going to be a very bloody, civil revolution there throughout the 1950s into the early 1960s. India, right? So India, we're going to see a lot of extreme violence right at the very end. You could make an argument that, the Bengal famine in 1943, which results in 3 million people dead, is an example of mass violence by the British on the Raj. But more specifically, this is kind of referring to what happens just before independence, right? So we see one of the greatest humanitarian crises ever in world history in 1947 in South Asia. Over 10 million people are going to be, relocated, often forcibly relocated, as a result of the partitioning of South Asia into East Pakistan and West Pakistan and India. Estimates range from 500,000 killed to around 1 million killed, on top of the 10 plus million relocated or forced to relocate. Very, very violent time. Kenya, probably most famously is the Mau Mau uprising in the 1950s. All right. Cyprus is, you're going to see a lot of Greek and Turkish violence following the British leaving. And of course, Angola and Mozambique, this is the Portuguese colonies that are, very, very bloody, definitely part of the Cold War as well, as part of that story. All right. We also see a failure of institutional transfers. India is the great exception to this. When you look at India, you do see that legislative body, democracy that is created in the mid-1930s as a result of the pressure and the success of the Salt March. And then that body is able to, transition from 1947 in August, when independence happens, to 2 years later creating a constitution. And the Indian Constitution of 1949 is still the basic framework for their government today. So it's a very rare example of a legislative body or counseling body that existed under colonialism that survives, and was able to make this transition. In almost every case, there was some kind of advisory body, in these colonies that was helping the colonial powers rule. Very few of them survive this transition. The failures of nation building. Like, how do you create? You have lines that are drawn on a map, so now you're a nation. Now what? Right? You're Nigeria. Right? So the lines are on the border. Does that mean that a national identity is now created? And of course, how well you economically and culturally integrate the different ethnic groups that exist within your newly sovereign states is going to play a huge part in this, right? So these countries did not come to be formed in the traditional way, right? So there's going to be some failures there. So, and of course, the underlying reasons for these shortfalls. Empire is the default mode of political organization for the past 2,500 years since Persia. Or for those of you guys who are really into ancient world history, you could even argue 3,000 years if you want to go back to Arcadia, or the Assyrians, right? The Assyrian Empire. But empire is the default, right? You're either growing or you're not. You're expanding or you're not, right? So the nation state, right? The ones where borders fit the culture and ethnic identity are extremely rare. If you ask, those of you guys who take AP Human Geography. If I were to ask you to give me a couple of examples, most can give me some that worked before, the last 20, 30 years. But today, basically, what are the homogeneous societies that are left today? Besides Japan, right? Besides Japan, I don't know. All right, and of course, migrations of humans throughout history have proven that there is no fixed identity. Reality is there's just not very many homogeneous societies out there. Most of them heterogeneous, diverse ethnic groups. If you think the United States is the only diverse country on planet Earth, then you're not aware of this course. All right, so most of what we've been doing is migrations and diasporic communities and such. So, after thousands of years of that, and for this entire course, it's been pretty intensifying levels of it. You're going to have no fixed identity, which means shared national identity is going to be a challenge. All right. So decolonization, why does it happen when it happens? All right. Why after World War II? All right. So the European colonial powers following World War II, you have to remember that, Germany is the economic hub of Europe, and it is literally in rubbles after years of fire bombings. France has been occupied since 1940, right? They're just getting back, they're recreating their government from nothing. England is, after a year of the Blitz and then dedicating all their resources, they are economically in ruins. Obviously Russia is in no position to do much, but they're not a very big part of the story initially. So when you take the fact that economically they are in Europe is in ruins, you've also just lost around 40 plus million of your people, in the war. There's not going to be a lot of financial ability to maintain empire. And if you're talking about a democracy, the political will is simply gone. It's, how do you make arguments to send your, send the children, send the sons of the mothers in your country. How do you make the argument to send them to Kenya, right, to fight against the Mau Mau uprising? How do you make that argument to send them to India? If you wanted to try to keep that empire together, it's something that there's just not a lot of political will for. Right, and obviously no economic will. The other reality of this too is because they were, if you want to kind of throw the Cold War context into this as well, if you wanted to maintain an actual presence somewhere, you would need to get the political will at home to send the children, right, to send your kids overseas. You would need to muster the kind of economic means to do so, which also means you need to get, if you're in England or France, you need to get the United States on your side. And if the United States would support the intervention, then that means you'd have the economic means to do so. And you also wouldn't have to worry as much about the Soviet Union, right? If the United States does not give the green light, as we see in the late 1950s in Egypt, France and England, even if they want to intervene militarily, they will back off if the U.S. doesn't support those endeavors. So, yeah, there's the reality is after World War II, the entire political world shifts. All right. Portugal, and of course, the answer to that question is why is Portugal remain? Portugal doesn't have to worry about political will until the mid-1970s because they're not a democracy until the mid-1970s. So autocratic states are able to kind of push the boundaries further than democracies are. So we see Portugal holding on as a colonial power in Angola and Mozambique for much longer. Right. The Cold War, right? European powers like Great Britain desire to maintain a commonwealth to maintain parity with the new geopolitical superpower. As a kid growing up in the United States, I'd really never, I'd heard of the word Commonwealth, like the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, but hadn't really thought about it as a concept. I guess I knew Canada was a Commonwealth country, but never really thought about that. I guess it wasn't until I lived in Australia when I was in high school, that I learned about things like the Commonwealth Games. Did you know that they have the Commonwealth has its own little version of the Olympics that's only for Commonwealth countries, right? So as a way to provide some kind of unity, and hence Great Britain will get some relevance in this new bipolar, Cold War era. So and there is some unity associated with being a Commonwealth country. So there is some success with this. Would this success, eventually mean support militarily in case England had to go to war? Yeah, maybe. I don't know if the last 20 years has kind of shown that out or not, but maybe. All right. So, and number 3, strategic transitions. If you are in no economic position to maintain it, a colony, if you don't have the political will to maintain a colony, and you know that you need the United States' approval to maintain a colony, then maybe you need to start looking for a viable successor, right? And by viable successor, we're simply talking about, there's usually not a lot of preconditions for this, but what are some common preconditions? Not a socialist. I can't think of much else, okay? But ideally somebody who will have a relationship with you economically, and politically. So, basically, when do we see, when do we see decolonization take place? Like, why does decolonization of India happen in 1947? It's not like some kind of well-planned out thing. It's a strategic transition, right? Who can we throw the keys at and get out, right? And so there's not a lot of, there's not always a lot of justification for who transition of authority is passed to. All right, decolonization. What are some of the common categories of analysis kind of issues that arise? Form of governments. You're going to see a lot of countries will advocate self-determination and democracy, and division of power between centralized states and the local authorities, like a federation. At the end of the day, you're often going to find unitary regimes that are largely autocratic, right? Autocracy. The Cold War, right, provides an environment where two superpowers attempted to establish hegemony over the new regime. So what does this mean? If you are a brand new country and you've decided to, have a positive relationship with the British, your former colonial authority, what does this mean? That means that the Soviet Union is probably going to be sending in the KGB to identify groups that will undermine you and maybe even supply them with training and weapons. If you are a country that has maybe fought a bloody revolt against maybe the French authorities, say you're Algeria, and let's say you then are you're then going to establish a relationship with the Soviet Union. So what does that mean? That means the CIA is gonna try to identify groups within your society that will undermine you. These are in the context of the Cold War. Decolonization couldn't have really happened at a worse time. No matter what relationships you develop, the other major superpower is going to attempt to undermine. And of course, you're going to have attempts to undermine the attempts to undermine as well. Probably the most famous case of this is why does Nelson Mandela end up going to jail in South Africa? He advocated socialist practices. The South African regime was friendly with the United States, and because there was a relationship between the socialists and the Soviets and Mandela, the CIA, had informed on him, and was part of the reason why he was arrested. Right. So, there's the Cold War is an interesting context, and very rarely does it not have an impact at all. Right? Very, very rarely. Lack of established institutions. Right. So, once transition does happening, or when they're negotiating the transition, because they don't have their own established institutions, very rarely are they going to come out of colonization like they were before they went into colonization. Even the most developed countries like China will lose some parts of its former empire. Of course, India, right? India will spin off East Pakistan, West Pakistan being Pakistan today, East Pakistan being Bangladesh today. They will all spin off different parts, right? And not come out the same. Decentralized power legacy. Colonial powers have ruled from afar by devolving power down for administrative reasons. So what that means is that they did rely on individuals at the local level, at the decentralized level. Well, now we're going to largely see a lot of unitary governments get formed, which means all these former decentralized power brokers are going to become sources of instability within their countries. And of course, if those decentralized administrative authorities that had existed in the past, if they are from ethnic minorities, then we're going to see a lot of subnational claimants of power taking place here. A lot of rectification campaigns taking place, payback. right? And of course, national identity, right? It's kind of something we talked about a few minutes ago. There's an old quote there, I think it's Bismarck, right? War makes the state. European national identity is largely established through centuries of violence. In some countries that violently win their independence, this will be less of a problem. In other countries where, independence is handed over or negotiated, national identity is going to become a question mark. All right. So just another visual here, right now that we've kind of talked about this, right? So Europe before, European imperialism before, European imperialism after 74. All right. So when you look at this, you look at kind of all the new countries that are created, the colonial affiliations that are there, and then the dates in which they get their independence. It's a lot to wrap your mind around. Or if you want to see a more total picture, right? This is there are problems associated with so many countries becoming independent in a very small window of time. I'm sure you could probably figure out there's going to be some issues with this. Okay, I have some categories of analysis that you may want to kind of think about. When you're looking at talking about this topic, right? So methods of decolonization. How did they attempt it? How was it attained? There's colonies that negotiate independence. We're going to have some countries that have significant nationalist movements. We're going to have some that gain independence through armed struggle. And then, of course, we're going to see in some places regional, religious, ethnic conflict in the inherited imperial boundaries. All right. So if you want some examples of this, so these are the categories of analysis, and these are some of the examples. So as you do your homeworks for this unit, make sure you're kind of thinking about possible LEQ essays or SAQs that you might have to write about these topics, and be looking to plug in some evidence from your readings, that match up here. All right. If you like the visual, this is Mr. Freeman's. Right, Freeman's maps that he creates for his website. Right, that basically are the same categories of analysis that I just gave you. Okay. All right. So in class, we watched, just kind of give a look at just how fast all this happens. We did watch this video, and it's kind of a neat little thing. It's just showing, four countries, four colonial powers: France, England, Portugal, and Spain. And it kind of shows how they spun off. And there's a date on the bottom, right? So I'll just kind of show you the immediate aftermath, basically 1945 through the next decade or so. Right, so World War II just came to an end here, right? So India just got spun off, Pakistan, Bangladesh. Then right about 1960, plus or minus a year or two, is the big one, right? You see that. And by 65, most of it is done by this point. You'll get a few others, right? But just a different visual way of seeing how fast this process takes place and kind of how chaotic it is. If that doesn't tell you fast and chaotic, then just a different visual way of looking at it. All right, so also in class, we watched this video, at least in most of my classes today. We watched this video. It's about 10 minutes long, and it's a little intro to the Cold War. It's a Vox film, right? How America became a superpower, and it just runs through our country's history, and then kind of how we got to where we are today. And it wraps up around 2016 or so, or 17. Just after the election of President Trump, and kind of ask some questions that today you could probably start answering. Right, so there are some kind of questions that are asked based on the policy changes that were made. So which would provide a good discussion if we talk about that in class. All right, so that's about it for today. So and we'll pick up with this tomorrow. All right, so. Some key takeaways here. The events of World War II make the prospects of maintaining empire unfeasible, and the old empires that had once dominated the globe spun off their empires in a variety of ways. And of course, the global balance of power had irrevocably altered, or was. by this attainment of worldwide independence. It was a different world. All right. So that is it for today. Sapriati.